The night the storm rolled over Timberline Ridge, Clara Hensley thought she'd grown used to the sound of wind clawing at lonely walls. But that night felt different, as if the wind carried whispers of fate dragging its feet across the mountains. She wrapped her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped out to gather the last of the firewood before the drifts buried it, her boots sinking deep with each step, her breath a ragged white ghost in the moonless dark. And just when she thought she'd misheard the faint groan carried by the gale, it came again, a low, broken sound that didn't belong to the wind or any creature she'd known in these parts. Clara's heart slammed hard once, then steadied into the old rhythm of a woman who had learned that fear in the West is a companion you do not run from. Instead, she walked toward the sound, each step slow and careful, until her lantern beam brushed over what she first mistook for a stump buried in snow. But the shape moved, and her breath caught sharp in her throat as she knelt, brushing away frozen powder with trembling hands to reveal the blue-lipped face of a man who looked as though he'd crawled his last mile before the cold took him. His hair was dark, tangled with ice, his jaw scratched with days-old beard, and his coat, if it could still be called that, was torn across the shoulder as though a bullet or blade had ripped through it. She pressed her fingers to his neck, praying for even the faintest sign of life, and when she felt the weak flutter of a pulse, she whispered, "Stay with me, whoever you are," though he couldn't hear her. His eyes closed as if the world had already demanded too much of him. Clara hooked her arms under his and dragged him inch by brutal inch toward her cabin, the snow pulling at him as if trying to claim him back. And all the while she felt a strange certainty settling over her chest, as though she were not saving a stranger, but someone the world had placed in her path for a reason she did not yet understand. Inside, she stripped off his frozen coat and boots, her fingers stiff and burning, then worked to warm him. Blankets, heated stones, wrapped in cloth, a small fire coaxed back to life. And when at last he stirred just barely, she brought a tin cup to his cracked lips, letting a thin line of warm broth touch them. He swallowed with a sound that was both relief and agony, and for the briefest moment his eyelids twitched open, revealing eyes so gray they looked like the heart of a winter storm, eyes that searched her face as if trying to place her in a memory he couldn't fully reach. But before she could ask him anything, he drifted back into the dark, leaving her with questions she had no one to ask. Through the long hours that followed, Clara sat beside him, tending the fire, checking his breathing, wiping the fevered sweat from his brow as the storm screamed outside. And she found herself wondering what roads he had walked, what trouble had carved those lines of exhaustion into his face, what hand of fate had pushed him toward her cabin rather than letting him die unseen in the endless white. She had lived alone for 3 winters since her husband Henry vanished on a supply run that turned into a search party and then into a grave no one ever found. Loneliness had become a second skin. She stopped noticing. Like a scar, long healed, yet something about this man stirred a part of her that had gone quiet since the day she lost all sense of home. Near dawn he woke again, this time with a shudder that made his whole body jolt, and he tried to sit up, but pain bent him back down, his breath ragged. Clara pressed a gentle hand to his chest, her voice barely above a whisper. "Easy now, you're safe here," though even she knew safety was a fragile promise in the West. He tried to speak, but only a strained rasp came out, and when she leaned closer, he managed a few broken words. "Don't let them find me," before drifting out again, leaving Clara staring at him with new fear twisting in her gut. Them. Whoever them was, the word alone carried enough weight to chill her more deeply than the night air outside. As the morning light struggled through cloud and snow, Clara moved around the cabin with quiet urgency, checking the windows, stirring the fire, tending his wounds, which were worse than she first realized, long gashes across his ribs, bruising on his shoulder that told of violence close and merciless. And every moment she worked, she felt the press of something unseen edging closer. Like trouble had a scent, the land itself could smell. She watched him sleep, watched the way his face tightened now and then, as if fighting through some nightmare he could not outrun, even in unconsciousness. And she felt a pull inside her. She could not explain, as though this stranger's fate had become tangled with hers the moment she found him half buried in the snow. She should have been afraid, should have considered turning him over to someone in town, But the truth was she didn't trust the town anymore, not since Henry vanished, and folks began treating her like a widow carved of silence rather than a woman with a story. And besides, there was something about this man, some quiet sorrow in the way he breathed, in the way his fingers twitched, as though reaching for a memory slipping away. That told her he was running from something far crueler than he deserved. Late that afternoon, after hours of tending him, she sat on her small stool, rubbing the ache from her hands, when she realized he was awake again, watching her with those storm-gray eyes that gave nothing and everything all at once. They held each other's gaze for a long moment, the fire crackling between them like a fragile bridge, and when he finally spoke, his voice low and rough, it wasn't a name he offered but a question that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. "Why did you save me?" She opened her mouth, but no answer came. Because she didn't know. Because something deeper than logic had driven her to drag him from the snow, because the West had a strange way of weaving fates that didn't ask permission. She swallowed once, twice, and said the only truth she had. Because someone had to. His eyes softened, but only for a heartbeat, before fear flickered across them like a shadow cast by something approaching. He turned his head toward the window, listening with that sharpened awareness of a man who lived too long on the edge of danger, and Clara felt her pulse quicken as she followed his gaze, hearing nothing but knowing he heard something she could not. When she asked quietly, "What is it?" he didn't look away from the glass. Instead, he whispered almost too softly to catch, "They're coming." And before she could ask who, before she could demand the truth she had earned by saving his life, he gripped her wrist with surprising strength for a man barely clinging to consciousness, his voice trembling with a warning that felt like the first crack of thunder before a storm meant to break the world open. "If they find me here, they won't leave you alive." The moment those words left his trembling lips, Clara felt the world tighten around her cabin like a noose slowly drawing in, each second thick with dread as the stranger's warning settled into her bones. Yet she didn't pull her hand away from his grip. Instead, she steadied it, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "Then tell me who they are." But he shook his head with a pain deeper than injury, as if secrets themselves carved wounds that bled. "Knowing my name is danger enough," he murmured, his voice fading like a dying ember, and Clara realized she was sheltering a man whose past was not merely troubled, it was hunted. She stood and moved toward the window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to see the white expanse outside, the snowstorm easing into a bitter stillness that made every sound carry farther, and in that stillness she saw it. Faint movement near the tree line, shadows shifting with the slow deliberation of men who didn't need to hurry, men who already believed the land belonged to their boots. Her breath caught. They were coming. She turned to the stranger. This wounded soul fate had delivered to her doorstep, and she saw something new in his storm-gray eyes, something like shame, sorrow, and resignation twisted together. "Clara," he rasped, surprising her with the way he spoke her name like he'd known it long before she ever said it. "You should leave. Run. Take what you can and vanish into the hills. They won't chase a woman alone." But Clara Hensley had not survived 3 winters of loneliness by running. She stepped closer, her shawl brushing the floorboards, and met his gaze with the quiet, unbroken strength of a woman who had buried fear so deep inside she no longer recognized it. "I won't leave you to die," she said, and the stranger's face tightened with a mixture of agony and awe, as if he'd forgotten people like her, still existed in a world that had taken everything from him. He tried again to rise, but pain shot through him, and he collapsed back with a strained groan, clutching his ribs where old wounds met fresh terror. Clara moved on instinct, gathering Henry's old rifle from above the mantel, checking the chamber, bracing herself against the life or death decision she never imagined she'd face again. She wasn't a gunslinger, but she'd fired enough rounds to understand the weight of a trigger, the way the world shifted the moment a bullet left the barrel. Outside, the shadows grew clearer. 3 men, maybe 4, moving with the confidence of wolves that had already tasted blood. Clara's heart pounded, but she didn't let her hands shake. Instead, she spoke to the stranger without turning, her eyes locked on the approaching danger. "Who are they to you?" and after a long, pained silence, his voice answered with the heaviness of truth. "They were my brothers in arms, before they betrayed me," he said, each word cut with bitterness. "We rode under a man named Baron Slate, rancher on the outside, butcher in the dark. When I tried to stop what he was doing, they marked me for dead." Clara swallowed hard. She knew the Slate name. Whispers from travelers, tales spoken with lowered voices about land thefts, disappearances, a lawman found in a creek with his badge carved out of his chest. If the stranger truly walked away from Slate's men, then his presence here meant the storm outside was nothing compared to the one now heading straight for her door. The first knock wasn't a knock. It was a boot slamming hard into the wood, rattling dishes on the shelves. "Open up!" a voice barked, deep and vicious. "We know he's in there!" Clara steadied her breath, gripping the rifle tighter. The stranger forced himself upright, sweat rolling from his temples, his voice near breaking. "Clara, don't do this. They'll kill you." She turned just enough to look at him, her eyes calm in a way only grief and survival can carve. "I've already lost one man I love to the west," she said softly. "I won't lose another without a fight." A second kick splintered the lower boards. Snow drifted in through the cracks. Clara took position behind the table, barrel pointed at the door. The stranger, fighting consciousness, dragged himself toward her, but his strength crumbled before he got far. The door exploded inward, wood flying, and 3 men stormed in, coats heavy with frost, faces buried beneath bandanas, guns drawn with the ease of men who killed enough to no longer remember the count. "Where is he?" the leader demanded, stepping forward with a sneer. Clara steadied the rifle. "You'll step back," she warned, her voice clear despite the terror twisting inside her. The men laughed, sharp, cruel. "Lady, you got no idea who you're dealing with." The leader shifted his weight to advance, and Clara fired. The blast cracked through the cabin, deafening in the tight space. The leader staggered back with a howl as the shot tore across his shoulder. Chaos erupted. 2 other men lunged forward, tackling Clara as the rifle fell from her grasp, skidding across the floor. She kicked, fought, clawed, but one struck her hard across the cheek, sending stars bursting across her vision. The stranger let out a broken roar, dragging himself up with what little life he had left. He tackled the man closest to Clara, wrestling for the gun, blood dripping from reopened wounds, but desperation fueled him. For a moment, the cabin became a whirlwind of fists, boots, curses, and splintering wood. Clara crawled toward the rifle, every inch a battle, her breath burning. Behind her, she heard the stranger cry out as a boot drove into his ribs, the leader shouting, "Hold him! Baron wants him alive!" Clara grabbed the rifle, rolled onto her back, and fired again, this time hitting the man standing over the stranger. He collapsed with a grunt, dropping his weapon. The last remaining attacker swung his gun toward Clara, then froze. The stranger, bleeding heavily, had picked up the fallen man's revolver and aimed it at him, hands shaking but determined. For a long heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the last outlaw slowly raised his hands and backed out the broken doorway, fleeing into the snow. Silence returned, heavy, trembling, unreal. Clara rushed to the stranger, catching him as he collapsed. "Stay with me," she whispered, pressing her hand to his wound. "Don't you dare leave now." He looked at her, eyes softening even as pain clouded them. "You saved me, twice," he murmured, his breath shallow. "I never even told you my name." Clara shook her head fiercely. "Then tell me now." His lips curved in the faintest, weary smile. "Elias," he breathed. "Elias Ward." She held him, tears warm against the cold air drifting through the broken doorway. And as dawn crept over Timberline Ridge, painting the snow in pale gold, Elias regained strength little by little under Clara's care. Days turned into weeks. Danger faded into distant rumor, and 2 souls, broken in different ways, found something in each other the West had long denied them. A new beginning carved from survival, sacrifice, and a fate neither saw coming. And though the land remained wild, and shadows still whispered of men like Baron Slate, Clara and Elias stood together against whatever might come, bound not by chance, but by the night. She pulled him from death's hand. That was the day their destinies changed. That was the day the West decided their story was not finished.